Buddhadhamma, Section 3, The Process of Life, Chapter 5, The Law of Karma, or Kamma. Page 429. As part of a practical analysis of good and evil, punya and papa, Gautama Buddha first encouraged people to reflect on kusala and akusala qualities as essential for the factor for evaluation. He developed the teaching to include an awareness of good and evil as it manifests in the mind, to apply to one's conscience, and to consideration of opinions by wise individuals as frame of reference. These two factors act as the basis for moral shame, hiri, and the fear of wrongdoing, ottappa. Moreover, he encouraged people to consider the fruits of their actions as they affect themselves and others, that is, on an individual and on a social level. Because people lack the necessary depth of panya, or wisdom, they may not recognize for themselves what is wholesome and unwholesome. Gautama Buddha encouraged them to consider the opinions of the wise. If they still have doubt, then they should examine the effects on their own actions, even as they relate to social conventions. This threefold examination and awareness of wholesome and unwholesome, a consideration of opinions by the wise, and an examination of the effects of one's actions leads to a comprehensive analysis. In summary, when evaluating what is good and bad, kamma, one first takes intention, cetana, into consideration to decide if an action constitutes kamma. And then one may apply the following criteria. Principal criteria A. 1. Measuring the wholesomeness and unwholesomeness to consider whether cetana, intention, springs from a wholesome root, kusala mula, for example, non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion, and whether it springs from a unwholesome root, akusala mula, from greed, hatred, and delusion. And point 2, to consider whether an action is truly conductive to spiritual well-being or not. Is it conductive to mental ease, health, peace, and clarity? Does it strengthen or impair the mind? Does it help to increase wholesome qualities and decrease unwholesome qualities, or vice versa? Moreover, what sort of effect does it have on one's personality? And associated criteria B. Applying one's conscience, one's inner sense of right and wrong. One asks whether by acting in such a way is one worthy of self-criticism, and does one lose one's self-respect? Associated criteria, also considering the declaration of wise and knowledgeable individuals. One asks whether a particular action would be approved by the wise, would they praise it or condemn it? Association criteria B, considering the attributes and fruits of action, both in relation to oneself and others. Does an action harm or cause distress for oneself or others? And does an action lead to the welfare or the suffering of oneself or others? Note that these two sub-factors of criteria, A and B above, are essentially the same. They both focus on whether an action is beneficial or harmful to people's spiritual life. Generally speaking, the approval and disapproval and praise and criticism of wise individual is institutionalized or systemized as religious, cultural, and legal teachings and prescriptions. Although some laws and customs do not accord with the opinions of the wise, and some actions conflicting with established laws and custom may not be censured by the wise, one may say that these causes are exceptional. It is the responsibility of wise individuals in society to regularly investigate these matters. In reference to this process, Gautama Buddha used the term investigated by the wise. Anuvicha vinyu. The wise first investigate a specific matter and then express their approval or disapproval. Having investigated these matters, they amend those things wrongly practiced or prescribed, those things that have deviated from their original and correct purpose. Gautama Buddha, for example, rejected the caste system and the tradition of animal sacrifices. There is another set of criteria for determining good and evil, or good or bad kamma, which takes into account the law of kamma on its own, as well as the law of kamma in relation to the conventional laws. It examines actions from the perspective of natural laws, the real inherent value of actions, as well as from the perspective of value attributed to actions by human beings. It contains the same principle as the outline described above, but arranged them in different ways. Number one, a reference to advantages and disadvantages on the level of mind. One, consider whether an action is supportive or unsupportive to a person's spiritual life, whether it enhances a person's quality of life, whether it strengthens or impairs the mind, whether it leads to increase or decrease of wholesome and unwholesome qualities, and whether it leads to a positive development of a person's personality. Number two, Buddhadhamma, Section 3, Process of Life, Chapter 5, the Law of Kamma, page 432. Number two, a reference to advantages and disadvantages on the level of individual. One, consider whether an action causes distress or harm to oneself, whether it damages or promotes true inner well-being. Number three, a reference to advantages and disadvantages on the level of society. One, consider whether an action causes distress or harm to others, whether it damages or promotes true well-being of others or of society. A reference to one's natural Number four, a reference to one's natural sense of conscience. One, consider whether actions by applying one's own sense of right and wrong, by asking after a deed is completed whether one is open to self-criticism and self-blame. And number five, a reference to social standards. One considers actions according to religious, cultural, and other social prescriptions, laws, and edicts. These prescriptions rely on the examination and scrutiny by wise individuals in a particular society who help to ensure that people do not uphold them naively or inadvisedly. These wise individuals also determine whether to accept or reject these prescriptions.